Okay guys, it looks like it's actually going to happen quite shortly now. We're going to get back out on track, and this is sort of kind of stating the obvious a little bit, but I thought, well, I'll just give people a bit of a heads up at some of the preparation I do, particularly after the bike's been wintered for a long period of time, and particularly this time where it's been wintered like, I don't know, 8 months now, thick end of. This is based on experience more than anything else, because obviously I've been around a while and I've seen an awful lot and had an awful lot kind of issues go wrong with me and the bike, etc. Bike maintenance is really important. The amount of times I've been at various circuits all over the place and I've seen people wheel their lovely, immaculate, beautifully polished CBR 600 or whatever, and they wheel it out the back of the van, and the bloody thing won't start, or it runs like a bag of nails, or they go to take the wheel out and they can't get the wheel spindle out, and all these sort of things which you really don't need when you've been off the bike for so long and desperate to get out there. So I've made a little list so nothing can be missed, and I want to run through it quickly with you just to kind of refresh to people and, you know, put on a little light in some people's little grey cells, perhaps sometimes things that they've missed. I always start with fuel. If the fuel's been in the bike for a long time, it may be worth draining out and putting fresh in. Fuel does tend to go off a little bit. It's not super critical, but certainly if you're running an older bike. And another thing about the fuel is I tend to leave my bike absolutely full to the maximum. Strange thing really, because I think that if you leave the tanks empty, what tends to happen sometimes is you get condensation can develop in the void in the tank, which of course runs to the bottom. You fill the tank up, and then you've got condensation sat in the bottom form of water, which causes all sorts of problems. So I tend to leave my bikes full up, and it's been full up now since August, I think, July, something like that. So I'm going to drain mine out and use the fuel for washing off and stuff like that and put fresh in. And I think that way, because you run the tanks full up of fuel, the air gap is very small, so potentially the condensation is somewhat less. Contamination happens, and also in the oil. If the bike's been sat for a long time as well, even if it's not done a lot, it may be worthwhile dropping the oil and have a look for any potential water ingress, any condensation which is in the motor, and you'll see that emulsification. You won't just see it through the sight glass if there is one on the side of the bike, but you will see it if you drop the oil. I mean, if it's clean and you put it into a clean container, the potential is you put it straight back in. But it's for the time it takes, I think it's well worth the thing, because if you fire the bike up, that's going to break the oil down and it's going to end up an emulsified bloody mess very, very quickly. And again, the last thing you want on your track day is to start rushing around trying to screw on fresh filters and wash the thing out. Bit of a nightmare. If you've got the time, the space and the opportunity, is pull everything off the bike. Again, it might not have done a lot, it doesn't make any difference. Mentally, I think it's a good thing to do because you can go through the bike carefully, and people wash the bikes and do a really good job of keeping the bikes clean, but you take a panel off and it's clear the fairings have never been off in a million years. And it's only when you start taking stuff off that you find, you know, cracks, loose bolts, wires which have been chaffing up against the side of things. So because you know, a lot of people have got time on their hands, is carefully take all the bodywork off from front to back, run through the bike to check for stuff, as I said, connections coming undone, all that sort of thing. Tyres, again, if you've got the bike sat in the garage, look for depending on how old the tyres are, etc. Most tyres will have a date stamp on them, so check your date stamps that you're not getting sort of 3 to 5 years old, and anything more than that you want to be sort of careful with. Check for things like cracks, because they do, if your bike's been caught out in the cold, sometimes they can potentially crack around the bead, something like that. And the old adage is, it's not worth the risk of throwing the thing up down the road because you have a failure of some sort, just trying to save money on the fact that the tyre's got a bit of life left in it. If there's a doubt, change it. It's always the best way around. While you're doing that, have a look at if you run, as it were, standard valve stems, which are kind of usually quite short rubber ones, is just have a quick check on them to say that they're not cracking and starting to split. I've found generally running the angle valve stems work a lot better, in the sense that particularly if you're just going to check the tyres just before you go out when everything's kind of warm, or particularly when you've just come in and you want to just do a comparison to see how much pressures the tyre's lost while it's been out on track, or gained, because generally speaking a tyre will gain pressure when it's out there. And you can do it a million times in the garage, but it doesn't replicate what's actually happening out. So often that's the very first thing as soon as I come in is pop the bike on the stand and check the tyre pressures, and that gives me an indication, a few psi one way or the other, what the tyre's been working at out on track. Then that's the tyre pressure. But of course all the discs are red hot, and if you've got the standard valve rubbers which go up in between the discs, you'll end up burning your hands to bloody death. So the angle valves are a lot better in that respect. Again, we're basing this on the bike's been stood for a while, is check and spin the chain. Make sure the chain itself hasn't started to seize up, because if you've got a couple of links which are seized up, saying going around the front sprocket which has been stood for a while, you need to get them moving. Otherwise you can create a potential tight spot in the chain. You create vibration if you carry on running it like that, and the potential is you may, worst case scenario, the chain may even fail due to a seized bearing or something like that. And you can loosen them off. It might need to sort of take the wheels out and sort of get in there and sort of start loosening the things up. And if you run a chain with an O-ring, they'll be a little bit stiff anyway with a period of time. So nice bit of lube, and make sure you've not got any tight spots in the chain. Suspension linkages. Again, it absolutely amazes me how many people don't check that. The rising rate suspension on the back of most bikes have some sort of a linkage system on them. And they very often are little thin needle roller bearings with bushes in them and seals and so on, and they can get contaminated and can start to seize up. And really the only way you can do that is put the bike on a stand which supports the weight of the bike, not particularly under the swinging arm, because ideally you want to pop the shock out, or certainly loosen the shock, so you can loosen the linkages off and just see if they all rotate nice and freely. I can remember one guy a few years ago, he came in after one session and the tyre was destroyed. He said, I can't understand it, I've just had the suspension serviced and it's destroyed the tyre. And I went over to the bike and I could barely push the thing down. And the suspension unit was trying to work, but what was happening was the suspension linkage was absolutely seized solid. And it took us about 2 hours of bashing and heaving trying to get the thing to free off again. Now this is the start of a 5-day test at Cartagena. Not a good place to be, really. So these are the sort of things I want to try and get people to have a think about. Brake fluid. Brake fluid absorbs, I can't remember the word what it's called, but it absorbs moisture. So even if it's been sat there for any period of time with no use, it's worthwhile for the cost of it is get some fresh .5 in there and flush it out so that you've got a decent brake, because there's nothing worse than the brakes all starting to fade, all because you've just got basically crap old fluid in there. Clean your calipers. Again, people do this all the time. The pads wear out, they push fresh pads in, they push the pistons back in to get the new pads in, and they don't clean them. And that every time you're pushing the piston back in, the potential is you're pushing dirt under the seals, which will eventually bugger the job up. So while you're bleeding the brakes or whatever, is check the condition of your pads and clean the pistons up. But I've found the best way of doing it, to be honest, is take the pads out, push the pistons out independently, and just nice hot warm soapy water, toothbrush if necessary, and get in there. I'm not a big fan of using solvents in there, which do a great job of the cleaning, but they can, I think, dry out the seals. So hot soapy water, and then push the pistons back in, fresh pads, and away you go again. Obviously, while you've got the chance, pop the wheels out as well. The wheel spindles will eventually start to gather dirt and detritus. Old grease on that starts to solidify, and it all starts to get stiff to get the spindles in and out. So clean them off, even if a bit of light emery if there's some spots you can't get off, but basically clean the spindles up. I tend to use copper slip, something like that. So I don't tend to use WD-40 or anything like that. It's a little bit too thin. Something which will kind of stay there, but the downside to doing that is the grease will attract dirt. So you may need to do this fairly repeatedly. But again, if you roll up at the first day, you get halfway through the day, think, right, I'm going to pop a tyre in, and you can't get the bloody spindles out. And I've seen this happen, so it does clearly happen. Camera mounts. Make sure your camera mounts are secure. Again, they've been sat for a long while. The double-sided glue pads, if that's what you've used, can start to fall apart, so give them a check. And I would always suggest use a nylon, not a zip tie particularly, but a nylon cord lanyard, so that the not only the base of the mount is secured, but the camera itself, because if the camera comes loose, it's gone, and it's big bucks, as well as it might hit someone in the head or whatever. So give them a look at. As far as I'm aware, from now onwards, basically, your bike won't be allowed on track if it hasn't got a lever guard. I don't know whether it's track day specific, but I'm pretty sure No Limits is one which are sort of enforcing this brake guard. So even if it's a road bike, apparently you have to have them. So I'd certainly check, and to solve any problems is get one and bung it on anyway. They're not a lot of money. GB Racing do a really neat and efficient one, and it works a treat. If you're running an open exhaust, not a standard exhaust, make sure you've got a baffle, and make sure the baffle fits. So it sounds daft, but the amount of people who rock up and they've got a baffle and they can't get the baffle in, or they haven't done it for a long time, and the bolt that they've got in isn't the right one, and they haven't got the right tool, and the amount of faffing about I've seen people trying to bugger about, trying to get baffles in or get baffles out, whatever, is get the baffle in and out, make sure it fits, make sure you've got the right tools, and make sure you've got a couple of spare screws just in case one drops into the exhaust or rolls under somewhere and you haven't got a screw to play about with. All of these things really are stating the obvious, but I just think it's worthwhile a bit of a heads up before you rock up at the first track day event and the day's ruined by something as simple. I know we all look after our bikes as much as we can, but with the duration of the time the bikes have been off track, things get forgotten, and the amount of time it's worthwhile just going over the bike front to back. I hope it helps, this little quick chat, and be careful out there, build your pace steadily, but for Christ's sake enjoy yourself.